Okay, welcome to my talk. So first of all, I hope you all had your coffee and you're wide awake. So I've got a lot to go through. I've got 138 slides, a lot of code. So let's get going. So first of all, where's Bodjar? Is he here? So first of all, before I get started, I want to say a big thank you to Bodjar for RubyC. I use it every day. It's fantastic. I have it set up as a linter in my editor and literally saves me every day. And to give you a real-world example, and for those that don't know what RubyC is, let me introduce you to my son, Charlie. He's 7 years old. And the other day, so I work at home, and the other day I was upstairs doing some programming. He came up, sat on my lap, watched me do some programming, asked questions about what I was doing. And so I told him a few things, and he wanted to have a go. So he wrote a little program himself. This is his first Ruby program, exactly how he wrote it. And he got it working, and he was happy, and he understood what was going on. But he asked me, he said, "Dad, what's all these yellow dots and these underlines? What does that all mean?" And so I explained to him that it was the computer telling him that although it works, it could be a bit nicer. And of course, this is what RubyC does for you. So then he wanted to fix it, and he did. So there you go. So Bodjar, there you go, solving real-world problems, helping us every day. Thanks very much. Right, so let me introduce myself. So my name is Andy, and I'm from the UK, as you probably realise. And now I get to tell you about my credentials, about why I'm qualified to speak to you. So first of all, I'm not on the Rails core team, and I'm not on the Ruby core team, and I'm not on the RSpec core team. In fact, I'm not on any core team at all. And in terms of pets, I don't have any cats, so no cat pictures, I'm afraid. And I don't work for a famous company, so there you go. However, I am a freelancer, and that means that you can hire me.
What's your rate?
Very expensive. And I can totally 100% help you with all of your projects. And don't forget, you can hire me. And if what I'm talking about today sounds interesting to you, then you can follow me on Twitter, send me questions, that kind of stuff. Okay, let's get down to business. So, first of all, let's talk about Rails. So I love Rails very much, and I love Ruby. And to illustrate how much I love them, I've created this emoji-style chart to illustrate. So along the bottom, I've got some languages that I've used over the years, and this is how they stack up together. So first of all, I learnt BASIC. My parents bought me a Spectrum when I was young. And BASIC's fine, but I remember spending hours and hours typing this code in, and the Spectrum that I had, you couldn't just type in the commands. You had to use special key presses to get words to come out. And it would take forever, and then you'd get something like the screen flashing. So not fantastic. Then I went to Visual Basic. Now, Visual Basic is brilliant. It's fantastic. It's got a nice GUI interface. You can drag and drop buttons, double-click, add some code, connect it to an Access database, and you've got a business application that will last you at least 20 years. So fantastic. Then I did some C++, and this is all about memory pointers and memory leaks. And man, painful. So I didn't enjoy that very much. But then, classic ASP. Has everyone done any classic ASP? Ben, awesome. Well, for those that don't know, classic ASP is the pinnacle of all languages. We don't have things like tests. You don't write any tests. That's nice and easy. And all of your logic goes in one file. So your markup and your queries and your business logic all in one file. So it's really good, really fantastic. Then I moved on to do some .NET. And C# the language is OK, but the rest of the ecosystem is pretty horrible. Now that is changing now, and it's improving, but that wasn't that great. Then I moved on to Rails. Now, I love Rails, and it's fantastic. It's not quite as good as classic ASP. It's close, but not quite. And this talk is about what we can do to Rails to bring it up to the level of classic ASP. Just some small things you can do. And then last on my list, you'll notice is PHP. Now, I managed to dodge PHP for the best part of 20 years. And along that time, I heard lots of scare stories. And, I tried to dodge it, but eventually it caught up with me, and I had to do some recently. And, I heard these scare stories, but when I actually got into it and did some, I was actually surprised. I was just surprised how bad PHP actually is. Okay. Anyway, back to Rails. So there's nothing quite like creating a new Rails app. Rails knew this is going to be awesome. It's not going to be like any other project you've ever done before. This project is going to be unicorns. And it's going to be rainbows. The world is great. And you're giving yourself a new hope. This project is going to be different. It's not going to fall foul to the pitfalls of before. But inevitably, over time, this new hope turns into disaster. And your unicorn isn't quite what you expected it to be. And maintaining a Rails app feels like this. There's fires, your clothes are torn. Oh my God, and look at this girl, look at her face. She's been maintaining that app for a long time. And to be scientific, let me show you this chart that I totally made up. This is how fast it takes you to develop any kind of feature in a typical Rails app. So when your project is young, you move at the speed of light, you can develop stuff really quickly. It's great, it's fantastic. But as time moves on, slowly and slowly, as the project gets older, it gets harder and harder to add stuff to your Rails app. Even a simple text change eventually will just take infinite time. And in fact, you'll get to the heat death of the universe before you can make that text change. It's so complicated. So why is that? Let's talk about this and what we can do about it. So one reason is these guys. It's the project managers, the bosses, because light speed is not quick enough for them. But that is a different talk, and I'm not going to talk about that today. What I'm going to talk about is this guy, skinny controller, and his friend, the fat model. And so when I was new to Rails, I follow the mantras, and you follow the community, and you follow these things. But in reality, it's not like that, is it? We end up with fat controllers and obese models. And as a freelancer, I go to different companies and work with them, work with different teams. And all everyone seems to do, it's this recurring pattern most of the time, is they just put stuff in controllers and models, and that's all they ever do. And that's fine for a whole class of application, right? That's totally fine. But when things get more complicated, and you have a more complicated application, or even just parts of your application that are more complicated, I don't think Rails really gives you enough guidance of how to do that. So, how can we improve things? So first of all, let's talk about single responsibility principle. And that basically means that a class should only have one reason to change. And so let's look at these things. So first of all, controllers. So in my mind, controllers should just be around HTTP. So obviously, they're your entry point into your application. They should fire off some other logic to do some stuff, and then they make sure that the right HTTP codes are returned, make sure the right views are rendered, that kind of stuff. They shouldn't really have any kind of logic in them apart from that. Now, models, in my mind, should just be about data persistence. In my mind, you shouldn't have all of your business logic in there. Things like associations are fine, and things that are like closely related to that model itself. So if you've got like an order, for example, things like maybe calculating tax, that kind of stuff, but not every single piece of logic related to that model. And then views, they should just be pretty dumb. Based on some data, should just generate some markup. That's their job. So if that's true, where does everything else go? Where do your validations go? Where does your business logic go? There's a whole bunch of stuff. So I think that Rails are missing these four kind of areas. So a good way to deal with input, a good place to put business logic, a good way to do database queries, and also how you deal with your UI logic. And again, just to emphasize, this is for like non-trivial applications. If you're building like a CRUD application, then this stuff, is fine to do it as you kind of do it now. So to kind of help things, I've been doing some different stuff with my projects, and the kind of patterns that I've fallen into, I've pulled up into this gem called Rectify that I've mainly just created for myself to use. But when I've gone into a few companies, people have shown interest and say it's quite cool, so I thought I'd talk about it. So what Rectify provides are a nice way to do form objects, a thing called command objects, query objects, and presenter objects. I'm going to go through and talk about each of those now. So first of all, warning, I'm going to show a whole bunch of code now, and it's really difficult to do examples for presentations, because if I make them too simple, then it's really hard to kind of convey the idea. But if I make them too difficult, or much more complicated, then it's hard for you to kind of read them and understand them. So try and use your imagination. Imagine these are not kind of geared around sort of CRUD applications. These are raw. Imagine you've got a harder application. So first of all, let's talk about dealing with input in a Rails app. So first of all, context. I want to go this way. So here's a controller that we've all seen. It's pretty straightforward. So this might be, for example, when you're registering a new user in an application. So you show a new view. You've got a create action that deals with it. And we have our friend strong parameters at the bottom that whitelists what attributes are allowed. So nothing new there. And this is what the model might look like. So a user has many things, and there's some validation on the email. But then slowly over time, what happens is we add some context to this. So let's say, for example, we add an update action. So maybe this is, once you've logged in, you can change your profile. And when you change your profile, you're allowed to add your age. So now we have in this same controller, we have two different contexts. We have two different strong parameters. Obviously, we could clean this up, but And then in your model, let's say, for whatever reason, your age is required when you're editing. So now we have two different contexts, creating and updating, and we've got whitelisted attributes and validations in two different places, and you've got to manage them together. So now we're seeing some complexity even now. And then we can have another context, like here, when the user is an admin. Maybe in this case, when you're an admin, you're allowed to change roles. So again, more context, more complexity. And so this thing kind of manifests itself in the controller, and the controller gets more complicated, so does your model. And because these two things are in two different places, it starts to get hard to manage. And that, in turn, increases complexity. So the next thing, in terms of dealing with input, is structure. And what I mean by that is that your forms end up mirroring the structure of your database. And again, that adds complexity. So in this example, so we have a form here where we have a company that has a name, and then we create the first user as part of signing up. And in this case, in a database, we actually store the first name and last name for the user, but we want to just let them type in full name for whatever reason. So this is what the models might look like. So we have company, and then we have accepts nested attributes for. And I don't know about you, but whenever I try and get that to work, I have to try a million times, a million different things, and just keep changing stuff till it works. I don't fully understand it, but anyway. And then on the user, for example, so we've got this full name thing, so we have to have these virtual attributes. And this is what the kind of dance you have to do if you want to have your forms looking different from your database structure. Now in this case, the full name are only used when you're signing up, when you're using that sign-up form. You're not using anything else, but you've still got that code in your whole user model that's used throughout your whole system. And so so structure, this is about where your forms end up matching your database structure, which you don't always want. And the last thing I want to talk about in terms of dealing with input is types. So don't forget that the params hash you get is all strings. The keys are strings, all the values are strings. And unless you do some kind of type conversion, if you start passing that stuff around your system, eventually, if you try to do some calculations, you're going to get errors. And that's because you're not dealing with types properly. Yeah, there you go. So let me introduce you to form objects. So form objects are going to do these kind of things. So first of all, so they deal with your input. They deal with whitelisting of parameters, so we don't need to use strong parameters anymore. That's where you have your validations, so your things are all together. They give you a level of indirection for your models, so you don't have to have your forms matching your database structure, and also dealing with the type conversion for you. So let's look at what a form object might look like. So this is what comes from Rectify. So you just create a class, you drive off of Rectify form, and then you just list out what attributes you want. And if you notice, the name of the class is based on the context of what you're doing. So the top one there, when we're registering a user, we have first name, last name, and email, and the validations for that context. So it's all together in one place. Likewise, the bottom example, when we're updating our profile, we add age, and we add the validations. And notice on the when you declare your attributes, you can define a type as well. So here's another example. This is for the second example we saw previously. So when we want to have, so the top attributes are the company name, the full name and the email, and then the piece of logic we had there to deal with the data input to separate the full name into the two parts are all encapsulated into this one class, is just dealing with that form data, and it's not used anywhere else. So we don't need to pollute our models with that. And so then, if you do this kind of thing, your forms can get more simplified. So at the top we had the version we had before, and at the bottom we just have a much more simpler version, where we're just generating a form for some fields. And then this is what it looks like in a controller. So when you've got your new action at the top, you just new up your form object. And then in the create, when the data gets posted to your controller, we just populate the form object from the parameters. And then we have this, we have a valid method that will check all the validations that you defined. And if it's cool, then you can do something interesting. Otherwise, you can render a form. And no strong parameters, which is great. And this is an example of using a form object when you're editing. So at the top, when we show the edit view, we can populate a form object from a model. And in fact, this could be any Ruby class. It doesn't have to be a model. And then the update just works exactly the same. But here I've just got an example of just how you pull out the data. So you can use dot notation to pull out your types. Also notice that the age, for example, there is typed correctly based on how you defined it. And if you want to pull out everything, you can just call attributes and get the hash of everything you defined. And here's an example of one that's a bit more involved. Similar thing, so forms can be derived off of each other. And also a form can have a nested form, and also even an array of other forms. And like when you do validations, for example, it will traverse everything and make sure everything gets validated. So that's pretty nice. So to me, that is much better. I don't know what you guys think. So the next thing on the list is business logic. So where do we put business logic? So first of all, in the controller. So I go to a lot of places and I see people, they've got a simple controller, just like this. And then a new requirement comes in and says, well, if the registration works, for example, after it's, if it works, then do something else. And the first thing people do is just chuck a whole bunch of code in the controller. So it doesn't matter what this code does, so don't worry about that. The point here is there's a chunk of code that goes in the controller. Now, as I said before, in terms of responsibility, controllers shouldn't be responsible for that. That's not HTTP stuff. That's business logic. So, it shouldn't go there. So how about the model? Let's move it there, shall we? So if you do move it to the model, your controller ends up being much cleaner, so that's nice. You add it to your model, and that's fine. But one of the things I like to do is if I have a big method like this, I like to refactor it and have many smaller methods that are well named and they kind of work together. And that's fine if you do that. You end up with something like this kind of code. But the problem here is that, and it's down to this style, I guess, is that you end up with your model that's got lots of methods in it, and a certain group of them will work together, but you've only done that to improve your code. But then over time, if you do that for every single piece of business logic you have, you end up with this kind of model. And that's not great. So so you just end up just putting stuff in models. You end up with God objects. Things are hard to understand. And your model in particular ends up with two responsibilities. I mean, it's got two responsibilities anyway with, how our active record does stuff. But so then I go to places and they say, Andy, don't worry about it. It's all cool. We do service objects. I'm like, cool, okay, that's cool. And they do this. They do user service and just chuck everything from the model into user service. And I'm like, man, that's not right. So when people misunderstand service objects, it kind of leads to this kind of thing. So I want to introduce you to a command object. And a command object allows you to encapsulate one type of business task into one class. And we name it as a verb rather than a noun. I'll come on to that in a second. And so you call it from the controller. And the rectify ones allow you to have multiple results that come out. And it means we don't need to worry about callbacks. So let's see an example. So this is an example of a command. So it's pretty straightforward. You just create a class, derive off of rectify command. You have a constructor. So a constructor is where you accept whatever data your command might need. Typically, it'll be a form object. but it could be that plus other things, or it could be just, don't have to have that. And then you just have to implement a call method, and the call method is what does your business logic. And we use a gem underneath called Whisper that allows us to do broadcasting of events. And these events can be anything, so I've got invalid and OK here, but they can be, you just make those up. So here we check the form is valid. So if it's invalid, we broadcast an invalid event and return, so we don't execute any more code. We do some code, and if everything's cool, then we broadcast OK. And this means that because you've got a single class, you can encapsulate all of that logic in one place. If you want to break stuff out into multiple methods, then you can put it all in here, and it's all together in one place, easy to understand. It doesn't pollute your model. And this is what it looks like in the controller. So in the create action, for example, so here we've got our form object we used before, and underneath we've got this register user call. It takes the form object, so it will then call the call method underneath, it will do its stuff, and then you can then react to whatever events have been published. So if it's OK, we'll redirect somewhere, and if it's invalid, we'll go and render new again. And here's another example of a command that's just got a bit more stuff in it, just to kind of fill things out. So just to illustrate, in the constructor, you can pass in as much stuff as you want, form and a customer in this case. So this is for placing an order. And the important thing here is about the name. So I think naming is really important. So because I've named this place order, it's much harder to put stuff in here that's not related to placing an order because because of the name, right? So it's very important to get naming correct. And then inside your call, so you can do as many broadcasts as you like, depending on what you're checking for. And then obviously you can have your business logic. And so then I like to separate each kind of subtask, if you like, into different methods. And then inside the call, it kind of reads like a script of what's going to happen. So it's much easier when new people especially come to your team, they look at this, they can see what's going on, and the bit that they're interested in, so say they're interested in what happens when we're notifying customers, they can just go into that part of it, don't have to understand a full block of code. And this is what it looks like when you call it. So just like the other example, but here we've got an extra thing we're handling. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned, in the OK, you can pass out data. So here in the broadcast OK, we're passing out the order that we created. And then in the controller here, in the on OK, you can get the order that was created and do stuff with it. So that's how you pass data backwards and forwards from your things. So this is much improved, I think, personally. So next thing is database queries. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what? We've got active record. We don't need any database queries. And that's true. But when I go to teams, what happens is, a lot of the time they end up building their queries inside the controllers. So you see like user.where. And obviously that works, but it's not very reusable. And again, it's not really responsibility to the controller to understand how to query stuff. So of course then you can move it into your model. And this is, so I much prefer this stuff, especially when things are smaller and simpler. But again, it's this thing where you start adding more and more queries to your model, queries grow. So again, it doesn't matter what this code does. The point here is that you're getting more and more complex queries. Sometimes your queries, you're going to need to run some logic to generate some kind of data that your query needs. And again, you end up with this thing where you have different methods working together, but only for that particular task. And sometimes you have to drop down into SQL. Sometimes you want to use some special features of your database that Active Record doesn't support, or you want to maybe optimize. And again, these are just sources of your models getting bigger and bigger over time. So let's talk about query objects. So a query object allows you to encapsulate a database query and any other logic it needs to operate. So Rectify ships with this. So again, just create a class, and you derive off of Rectify query, and you just have to supply a query method. That's all. And as long as you return an active record relation, then it will just work. And once you do that, so underneath the example of what you can then do with a query object, so standard stuff, count, first, exist, all that kind of stuff, all your enumerable methods are available, and of course, obviously, each as well. And so here, if you wanted to pass in some information to your query object, you just pass it in the constructor. So here, we're just passing in age. So pass in 25, my age. And then you can do a count, so it's nice and straightforward and everything's encapsulated. And so here's another example of a query, just now with some simple but required extra processing needed to be done. So here you can see, because we're encapsulating everything into one object, things are nicely together, you're not polluting your module again. So just another option to not pollute your models. And one of the things we like about Active Record is that we can compose queries together. And we can do that with rectify command query objects as well. So here, there's a few options of how to do it. So you can use the pipe operator, which is the same as when we do in Ruby for set unions. So query object, pipe query object will give you another query object that you can operate on. Or we've got a merge instance method you can use if you prefer. Or we've got a merge class method where you can just apply a whole list of query objects. And for those of you who want to do some drop down into SQL, we've got a nice kind of story for that. So same query object as before, but we just include this module, and that allows us to just supply a nice string, which is your query, and a nice way to separate out the parameters it needs. And again, you can encapsulate your logic in here that's needed. Much better, hey? Thanks, Leo. And the final thing about is the UI logic. So first of all, let's look at views. So in a view, we have some markup and some logic. Now again, this is a simple example, but you get the gist. And to me, this is even too complex for a view, because here, this is not really reusable very much. And it's still logic and how to format stuff. So in this example, I'm just looping through the times from 8 in the morning till 10 at night, and I'm just rendering out a list of timestamps. So it'd be 08, 100, 09, etc. So the first thing we do is we reach for helpers. Now, I'm not anti-helper, but there are some problems. So you might create an hours method, and you can encapsulate this logic in here, and you can generate your markup, and then your view at the bottom here, you just have hours. So your view's nice and clean. But the problem is with helpers, first of all, they're for modules, so you don't have the same OO constructs that you do with classes. And also, it's not really very explicit. You just got this hours, and because it's a helper, it's a global method, so you don't really know where it's come from. And also, you can have things like name clashes. If you have a couple of different helpers that have the same method name, which one's going to get called? I don't know. So there are some issues with that. Oh, and also, generating HTML from here, that's not my favorite thing. I think that should be in the view itself. So here's another example of a view. You see this kind of stuff all the time. So is the current user an admin? And is the current user's company plan a paid one? And if so, show a binning link. So again, it's some more business logic in your view, even though it's quite simple. So again, we can reach for a helper, and we could do this stuff. But in this example, just the same problems as we have for the other one, but here we've got this magic current user that's come from somewhere, because that's a helper in itself. It's not very explicit. So to kind of help with these issues, we have a presenter object. So in Rectify, this is something that allows you to encapsulate your view logic, and then it means you can do this for either a full page, or you can do it for just components of a page. And this is how it looks. So here we've got a calendar. So we've got an example. So we created a calendar presenter, and this is because we're rendering a whole bunch of time. So we have an hours method that we're going to expose out, and here we're going to loop through the time from 8 till 10, and then we're going to call this formatted time helper method. And so here you can see, because we've got a class, we can have some private methods, we can encapsulate some more complicated logic in here, keep it all together. So that's nice. And this is how you set it up in the controller. So in the controller, you just add this this module at the top, and then you can call present, and then you give it an instance of a presenter. And then inside your view at the bottom, we get presenter. That's something that was given for us. And so presenter is the instance of whatever presenter object you've put in your controller. And so now we can call the method on it. We can loop through, and now so we keep the markup in the view, and we keep the logic in the presenter. And so in the case of when we had the billing link before, and we had that mystical user object, so now we can expose an attribute called user, and we can pass that in. We'll see that in a second. And when we're generating our billing link, we can move our logic out again. So to keep the billing link method simpler, we can just have this separate show billing method that encapsulates that logic. So it just makes things easier to reason about, keeps things simpler, keeps things together. And so when we're calling this this method, So when we create the presenter, we pass in the user we're interested in. So in this case, it's the current user, but that means we can reuse this in other contexts and pass in a different user. It may not be the current user. So that's nicer. And then in your view, just as before, presenter.billing link. It's all good. And you can have multiple presenters in a view as well. So you can have, so if you want one that represents the whole view, you just call it as we did before, just at the top, and that gives you a presenter method in the view. But if you want to have things that represent maybe components of a page, so maybe a menu or your footer or whatever it might be, you add this for option at the end, so for menu or for footer. And then when you're inside your view, you can call presenter menu, and then all the methods that are in that presenter are then available to you. So yay, much better. How am I doing for time? Wow. Okay. So the next thing is testing. So testing is important, and Rectify ships with a few helper methods to make testing as easy as possible. So just with RSpec for the moment, but if you want to use Rectify, you can add this stuff to your test. So add this to Rails helper, and once you do that, you get some helper methods. So let's talk about testing these kind of things quickly. So testing forms actually is nothing special. They're just classes, and you just test them like you might test any other object. So nothing complex there. So that's nice. But you might want to stub a form now and again. So particularly when you're passing these into your commands. So here we provide this stub form method. So here you just have to give it whether this form is going to be valid or not, and then whatever attributes you want. And then the form that it creates responds correctly for valid and invalid, and also whatever attributes you give it. And also when you call the attributes to get a hash out, that responds correctly as well. And that stub form method is just a nicer way to do what we've done at the bottom there. So yeah, that's cool. And testing commands, again, because they're just objects, you just test them as you would normally. The only exception to that is to make sure you want to test that the right events have been broadcast out. And so we have this broadcast RSpec matcher. So that works just as before. So here we're using a stub form. We create an instance of our command, pass in the stub form, and then we just make sure that the right has been broadcast. And in terms of testing query objects, again, it's pretty straightforward. They're just normal Ruby classes, so nothing special required to test those. You just call them, make sure the right stuff's been returned based on a known set. And if you need to stub your queries, we provide this stub query method. So you give it the command, you give it the query object you're trying to stub, and then what results you expect it to return if it's called. And then you can call whatever other method uses it. And then, so the benefit here is that this can really help speed up tests, because you don't have to set up a whole bunch of factories to create a whole bunch of stuff in your database to start with. And of course, you're not executing this query at all either, so it saves on that. So this is a nice thing to do. So I don't always do this, but I try and do this where I test the query object to make sure it's returning the right stuff, but then when it's used, just stub it out. Makes things nicer. And testing presenters, again, nothing particularly special. Test it as you normally would. So in the top example, we're creating a presenter. We pass in whatever data it needs, and we just make sure the right thing's been returned. The only exception to that is if, for example, you've created your own helpers like current user, and you do want to use it inside instead of being explicit about it, you can use this thing called attach controller, where you pass the controller that defines that helper, and you can use that too. You're good to go. So I've been through a whole bunch of code and a whole bunch of stuff, and some of you are thinking, what's the point of all this again? The point of all this is to try and help you give yourself some different homes, some different places to put stuff, not just your controllers and models, in a way that's a bit more sane, which then leads to making your code more manageable and reduces complexity. Now, whether you use Rectify or something else, don't forget, you can create other classes. You don't have to just stick to controllers and models. You'd be surprised the number of people that are like blown away when I say, you can just create a class. And I'm blown. So it's cool to do that. And also a key thing with this is to be pragmatic. So the Rails way is great, right? And I don't want to say you should never do that, because you totally should. And there's a whole class of application where the Rails way is the right way to do it. And also in your application, there's a whole bunch of areas where just doing it the Rails way is totally fine. But there may be some places like one or two maybe, where this can really benefit and really simplify things. So maybe think about that and use the right tool for the right job. And when it comes back to this, let's look at this graph again that I totally made up earlier. So this is the kind of yellow line I talked about earlier, where over time things get slower and slower. But I prefer to try and stick on this blue line. So maybe at the beginning there is slightly more work to do, but over the long term things are more stable and you don't have this big upturn. So maybe you should be betting on a success. So betting that your application is going to be around for a long time and it has to be maintained for a long time. So maybe some good architecture is a good idea. But also there's an interesting point where these two lines cross. So some applications, maybe if you're going to run out of money before you hit the blue line, maybe the yellow line is the right line for you. So think about what line you want to be on, make that decision, but make it a conscious decision, and just be aware of what the trade-offs are, depending on which line you pick. So I don't know if this is a good idea, maybe it's not. Maybe I'm just insane, I don't know. But if this stuff is interesting to you and you think it's cool, there's two other projects you should definitely look at. So Trailblazer, if you've not heard of that, go and check it out. Trying to improve architecture, so that's definitely a thing you should look at. And also DryRB, another project, long similar lines. So yeah, go and check those two out. And yeah, that's about it. So if you've got any questions, feel free to tweet me any questions you like, or catch up with me later, ask me some questions. Happy to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andy. Maybe someone want to ask now? One or two questions? Yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you for a great talk. I agree with pretty much everything you said. I just have a bit of a problem selling the single responsibility principle. For example, there's a class and I point out, okay, it's doing too much, we have to break it down. It's violating single responsibility principle. And then someone says, no, it's not. Then I try to come up with an analog that's gonna, be easy to evaluate. So I say, well, you have to describe what it does, what it's responsible for in one sentence, and then they say, oh, that's easy. It does everything related to the user.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing a bit, but it falls on the line. So how do you kind of pick the line, and how do you sell it to the other person?
Yeah, good question. Thanks. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, yeah, I think if you try and speak to someone like that and you try and get them to explain what it's doing, and actually have the code in front of you and kind of talk through it and say, well, what does this bit do? And what does this bit do? And say, right, this has got validations. It's got this thing dealing with orders as well. And just kind of just talk through it. And I think you'll quickly find that you'll see you're creating a list of what it does. It does this and this and this and this and this. And you can say, well, look, it's not doing one thing, it's doing 20 things. So I don't know.